Vertigo could be considered not just one of Alfred Hitchcock's greatest films, but one of the greatest films of all times. This is not just a matter of artful editing, a clever script, or fine acting. It's that Vertigo captures an essence of filmmaking and film watching. Like Velázquez's Las Meninas or Picasso's Demoiselles d'Avignon, it is a metafilm, a film about film, and therefore a film where we learn about architecture as well. For whatever goes into making Vertigo stand out in this way has to do with its uses of architecture and the landscape, as well as the theme of rising and falling or failing to rise, and mistaken identity, all of which create their own places to happen. This is one of those films where we go to learn about architecture. But there's an additional factor at work here. My claim will be that we need to look at Vertigo psychoanalytically, that is, through the works of Jacques Lacan. My thesis is that Lacan holds the key to Vertigo's architectural value. I develop it through the way anamorphosis functions within the film at multiple levels, but in particular, how anamorphosis is key to the construct of the scam or con that is the basis of the plot. I am always enthusiastic about the way Lacan provides architecture writers with new ways to think about architecture's position within the human scene. But at the same time, I'm very skeptical about persuading others. Lacan resets all of the standard questions and reveals new angles of study. But architecture audiences are focused on other things than theory these days. The trends in the schools rule out psychoanalysis for a variety of reasons, so there is almost no familiarity with the standard sources of Lacanian psychoanalysis, and in many cases, there's a strong prejudice against Lacan and his main source, Sigmund Freud. Slavoj Žižek, who has done so much to promote psychoanalysis in cultural studies, is widely popular in most academic programs, but either not studied or actively rejected in architecture. The buy-in for psychoanalysis is high, so I'll make my appeal in terms of things that have standalone validity from other perspectives. As my argument develops, I hope I will simultaneously be building a case for why psychoanalysis matters in architectural criticism. Why involve psychoanalysis in film criticism? And how would such an intervention be instructive for architectural theory? The legacy of the Freudian Lacanian field is unique. It is not philosophy. Rather, it is anti-philosophical in that philosophy has a hard time with the idea of the unconscious and puts neuroscience on the side of bodies rather than minds, where psychoanalysis would ask why bodies and minds require a divide and be interested in the split. This is because psychoanalysis is what could be called interpretation by the cut, in contrast to the kind of criticism that adds captions to works of art and replaces motives for actions. Interpretation by the cut halts the obsessive search for new meanings and isolates cases of non-meaning. It is interested in the impasse, the paradox, and the obfuscations that make consciousness turn away from what Žižek would call its materialistic ground. This is not materialism in the usual form, but it does allow us to consider mechanism in a positive light, as a self-mechanizing rather than a machine working from the outside as in a puppet show. Using interpretation by the cut for Vertigo focuses on the central paradox of desire that it constructs its own impossibility. Scotty, the hero of the film, fails to find love because of structural relations that have trapped him, and these give away a secret about love in general, how fantasy papers over the trauma that constitutes a real that can only be faked by what we call reality. The real resists interpretation. This is what makes it interesting and essential. My thesis is that the real involves its own form of virtuality, which is anamorphic in relation to the virtuality used to construct the pictures of what we call reality. Taken further, this second virtuality requires us to recognize a primary form of geometry that is more basic than Euclid, and whose ethnographical form was a geometry put in terms of mythology, storytelling, and the uncanny. There are a lot of issues to juggle in this project. Interpretation by the cut must keep focused on structural issues and avoid simply captioning contradictions as if they were things that needed to be resolved, like ghosts you get rid of by clapping your hands. The first step involves realizing how the movie uses the confidence trick, a relation between a con, a mark, and a shill or assistant. The shill is a double who must mediate between the con and the mark using a disguise. So, in our paper, Anahita Shadkam and I used the example of the thaumatrope, a small disc you spin to combine images painted on either side. The antiquity of the thaumatrope suggests that the idea lying behind this kind of anamorphosis has been around for a long time, appearing in many different forms. The function of paralysis is interesting because the same trick must be used by dreams to keep the sleeper immobilized. We introduced the term idempotency, a term coming from information science, to talk about insulation and paralysis, which in the con means keeping the mark in the dark. Our approach has taken the cut over to the way the dream must be presented on a field that moves across the paralyzed dreamer. And we transfer this figure ground reversal to the palindrome, which balances the system by flipping numerical or other kinds of sequences, and the linguistic version of the palindrome in the case of self-reference. The Cretan liar's paradox takes us to a fundamental antagonism in language between speech as an act and speech as content. Here, recognition of a second form of virtuality is unavoidable, since speech is, if anything, effective, despite its failure to filter out non-meaning. By combining a virtuality of effectiveness with idempotency, basically a spatial issue, we have new ways to deploy the idea of anamorphosis and find some ancient examples that show how projective geometry, which appears here in the form of the spindle torus and Mobius band, which pry open some very deep mysteries, in particular the death drive and its popular cultural counterpart, the death dream. We haven't found anyone who has commented on the possibility that the hero of Vertigo may be dreaming the plot in the final moments of life as he falls from a roof in San Francisco. Yet this is a key option, one that works, even if we don't accept it. The scam or con is like a carbon atom. It has 3 particles, one in the nucleus controlling the spin of 2 other particles, a mark or victim who is held in orbit by chasing another particle that is really a part of the nucleus, but when seen from behind as the mark chases it around the orbit, an electron. But the shill, this third party, is really a kind of quark, a pure energy factor, which takes on whatever identity we project. The mark imagines himself to be free, but the Khan and the shill are holding him in a tight circuit. The best filmic example I know of the con or scam is The Truman Show, where a character, Truman Burbank, is given a simulated reality to live. Everyone in his hometown of Sea Haven, Florida, is a paid actor, but Truman sees them as friends and neighbors. From early life onward, his life is viewed by a television audience who follow his everyday activities. These are mundane and not interesting in themselves. What fascinates the viewers is the fact that Truman is unaware of the apparatus surrounding him, the apparatus of the con. Another name for this is dispositive, which means gadget or apparatus. We want to return to the idea of the gadget in relation to a fundamental idea that is of instrumental cause. This is a kind of reverse angle cause, a multiplicity of causes, not just the one cause by one agency. In architecture, instrumental cause has become the name for the corrosive and coercive reductionistic forces of modern technology. But the earlier meaning was cause freed up as a kind of middle voice, where things seem to happen on their own, where there are no good guys or bad guys, where there are many causes for any one effect. Instrumental cause, I argue, is the key to understanding architecture as a work of art. The show's fictional town, Sea Haven, used an actual town, Dwani and Platter-Ziburg's mock gentrification development, Seaside, halfway between Pensacola and Panama City. The town had already been compared to a movie set, whose residents voluntarily chose to submit to a fake substitute instead of an actual historical urban dynamic town. There is as much of a con going on in Seaside as there is in Sea Haven. The only difference is that the audience of the actual town is implicit rather than explicit. There is still a secondary virtuality holding the residents fixed within a collective fantasy. The con, or scam, involves three distinctive and necessary components. The con is the designer of a plot involving misdirection and cheating of a victim called a mark. To accomplish this, the con must be assisted by what is called a shill, a name that may come from the term shilly-shally, and that from the expression I shall, indicating vacillation, a quick turn from one thing to another. The shill's vacillation is what secures the mark's trust. The con begins by assuming that the mark will mistrust his offer, but the shill converts this mistrust by seeming to be on the side of the mark. In the atom of the scam, the shill, who is a kind of quark, is made out of two things unified by a material basis that is both a solid object, a disk, and a spin made possible by suspending the disk on a twisted cord. What exists in this case is more the effect than the physical components or activating spin. It is the wonder that goes past the combined images back to the knowledge that the two things by definition cannot physically combine, but that this separation is in fact the reason that they do combine in the spin of the thaumatrope. The backstory of the thaumatrope is interesting and critical to understanding what's involved here. Thaumatropes have been found in Stone Age caves, where the spinning was possibly a kind of prayer or magical curse to assure success in hunting. In this example, the hole that holds the cord is at the exact location of the spear that kills the deer. A French archaeologist, Marc Azima, has suggested that this overlap between the material disc and the spinning is an early kind of cinema, where two images combine in perception to realize a wish. Slavoj Žižek has said that movies teach us how to desire. The thaumatrope shows how this early example of image creation is just as neurologically effective as film, a kind of essence of how film desires for us in a physical act, just like Tibetan prayer wheels pray for whoever sets them in motion. The thaumatrope shows how anamorphosis can take unexpected forms, but always with the same effect and effectiveness, in showing how the human subject is a subject, thanks to its access to a certain kind of virtuality. Whether this virtuality takes the form of a prayer, a toy, a trick, or a screenplay, it plays by the same rules, and discovering these rules is the aim of any theory about the human subject who speaks and who has an unconscious. The connection of Vertigo's Schill, the actress the villain Elster hires to con the retired detective, to the thaumatrope is quite obvious, but it is easy to paint Judy Barton, the actress, on one side, and the fictionalized wife, Madeline, on the other. It is actually the combined woman who is Madeline, the woman who is a pure enigma. So what is the physical source for what's on the other side of Judy's image? It's the actual wife, Madeline, reinvented by Elster to be a mentally unstable socialite with a suicidal obsession with a beautiful ancestor who was shamed to the point of insanity. This shimmering effect of the thaumatrope, of Madeline's mysterious paralysis before the image of the ancestor Carlotta, that holds Scotty's attention as Elster holds the twisted cord. Let's make a critical theoretical move here. The mark has to be kept in the dark. This is very much like a sleeper who has to be kept dreaming. Otherwise, the mark will discover how the trap works and look for a way to escape. The idea of the con is that the mark actually constructs his own trap. The function of the dream is the same as the con. So let's look at how the dream functions. It's true physiologically that the sleeper must be absolutely paralyzed for sleep to be effective. So the dream must defend the sleeper from external and even internal stimulation. The word for keeping a system in fixed states is idempotency, and in computer lingo, idempotency is what must be maintained against what is called a denial of service attack. This is when a server is flooded by simultaneous requests that overload its circuits and crash the system. In many ways, the brain and computer both face the same threats and both need to quickly install insulation. The dream insulates by producing an illusion, a dream. In the dream, the sleeper has the experience of a figure moving freely across a fixed ground. Unaware of paralysis, the dreamer moves, not the ground. But the sleeper is actually paralyzed. So he maintains this illusion by having the ground moving across the figure. This reversal strategy is also evident when some stimulus gets past the dream's defenses and has to be incorporated in the dream content. Because of the figure-ground reversal, this element may actually cause a dream and come first, but in that dream it appears at the end as a conclusion. This palindromic reversal provides us with an important clue about insulation and idempotency. How can the simple fact of figure-ground reversal be used to buffer the sleeper against disturbances that would wake him or her up? It would be easier to use a numerical analogy. Let's say that the dream wants to keep the sleeper's system set at a constant energy level, which we can arbitrarily assign a value, say 6. Along comes a stimulus which must be neutralized. Numerically, we could divide dream consciousness into two parts, each being a reversal of the other. The two numbers would always add up to the required value, but they would ascend in one channel and descend in another, a numerical palindrome. This palindrome theory would seem to be just a wild conjecture were it not for the fact that the score of Vertigo uses the same motif. The leitmotif is that of musical lines that crisscross over each other to produce an uncanny musical anxiety. I don't have the score exactly aligned to the recording here, but you get the idea. The palindromic zigzag above, ominous chords ringing out like church bells below, some major, some minor. Hitchcock's aim in making films was to be able to suspend the audience, literally, with actions and scenes that balanced motions in one direction with motions in another, failing to give away anything until the right moment to pull the film to conclusion. Suspense naturally forms palindromes, and here Bernard Herrmann, who composed the score for Vertigo, puts the idea into music. It's clear that he understands the role of the palindrome and its relation to the audience's experience of suspense. The palindrome is a kind of idempotency factor. Let's call it delta. It holds the film at a specific energy level and controls things while allowing for diversions and interruptions, just like the scam holds the mark in place and buffers him from accidental intrusions. The delta in a screenplay is the invitation for trouble to happen that can be contained within the fictional buffer of the film as entertainment. But what if the palindrome idea came from someplace deep within human thought and behavior? This would connect the popular culture experience of film to issues that affect everything we do as human beings. In language, which is both about content and the acts we perform to communicate that content, we can be forced to see the contradiction in our attempts to unify what is basically divided in two. This vulnerability has been evident since ancient times, and classic jokes have been told about our self-contradicting relations to how we divide ourselves through speaking, but then deny that we are divided. One of the most famous jokes is the Cretan liar paradox. A fellow from Crete walks into a bar and says, "All Cretans are liars, ha ha ha." He must be drunk, but the claim makes us think that we are drunk. We are stopped in our tracks by a statement whose circularity, or zigzag quality, keeps us going between or around two impossible positions. It's like robbing Peter to pay Paul, then Paul asks us to rob Peter again. There is no possibility of merger or union of the fact that either the Cretan is lying or telling the truth, but we can't say both. We bounce from one option to the other and back again, but that's the point. That we establish idempotency the same way Bernard Herrmann did, with a crisscross motif that palindromically always adds up to the same number, which we call delta. The deep secret of the Cretan liar joke is that all statements involve this vulnerability. There is what we might call an axiomatic unconscious within or behind everything we say, because we cannot say anything without having this division between acting in making the speech and containing something we claim to be the meaning of the speech. Yet we have to deny that there is any difference between these two modes. So it's us who are the Cretan liars. There is always a middle element that flips between the act and the content. But despite the fact that it's always there, we speaking beings always have to deny it. This is our big joke. There is a middle term created by act and content that constructs an axiomatic unconscious behind every statement. In our essay on Vertigo, Anahita and I compared this middle term to the thaumatrope and showed how the scam in the movie was a real person playing a very realistic role. One footnote here. To show how the middle term works as a spinning thaumatrope, I used what's called a syllogism in the style that Aristotle made famous when he said, "Socrates is a man, all men are mortal, therefore Socrates is mortal." The middle term is made of the two forms of man, individual, who turns into the universal men, only to be contained by the idea of mortality. The middle term appears in the upper part of the syllogism, the axiomatic part, but disappears in the conclusion. We are saying that this is a model for everything that is said and done in the human world. To catch on to the trick of the middle term, you have to grasp the way it cancels itself out. In The Truman Show, the middle term is the set design that looks to Truman to be exactly what he thinks it is, a typical American Southern town. He doesn't see the fourth wall that packages his everyday activities into entertainment for a mass audience. The action of the technology tracking Truman at every moment has to flip to produce the content, but its aim is to stay out of sight, both for Truman and for the television audience. This is what makes the middle term both an axiomatic space-time and a thaumatrope. It is in constant motion between its two conflicting roles. It must be on both sides of a two-dimensional surface, like the Mobius band, which seems to have two sides, but in fact is just one side, thanks to the twist that seems to be nowhere and everywhere. This takes us to a deeper level of our thesis, namely projective geometry, where surfaces intersect themselves but always involve a flip or inversion called non-orientation. The point in Vertigo is to keep the mark on the mark, in place, with a left-hand and right-hand version of things, a kind of ambiguity function. We call this chirality, a special kind of left-right mirroring relationship. It holds Scotty in a glide path leading to the con's goal, Scotty in the witness chair at the inquest into Madeline's suicide. The glide path is idempotency, a maintenance plan. Human language's difference from animal language is that human language can split itself into two registers and then make use of that split. This is more than just the ability to make jokes about cretins who say they are lying. A thaumatrope is really a kind of a split token called a tessera. These were ceramic discs used in ancient times when friends had to part. They would break the disc in two, and each friend would keep one half. When they met again, they would join the two parts together. And because the crack had formed a unique break, the reunion would be strengthened by the authenticity of the two parts exactly matching back together. In other words, the fracture of acting and representing allows for the introduction of the idea of authenticity. That would never occur if the representation which is automatically always a copy of something, to be its basis. The act and representation have to use something negative, an error, a void, a missing element, as a registration mark. This then allows a three-part time structure: breaking, parting, reuniting. This summarizes about 99% of the plots we read in novels or see in films. Because we don't want architecture to be about breaking apart, we think it's unrelated to this temporality. But here is a case for how it in fact applies to architecture as much as, if not more than, any other art form. The split that creates an interval is both a time and a space. Inside the space, things are symmetrical. A balance is created by matching elements that can be dispersed and joined, at one level at least, with other, even random elements. Although building seems to be primarily constructive, architecture begins with this splitting and expansion. We say that it's a thaumatropic expansion because the point is to maintain a constant value or a net value that maintains its balance in the face of interruptions. This is the function of the site of a building, to insulate it from the street and other buildings, to give it a unique order, that is, its identity as a building, while allowing elements to recombine and vary to create interest and suspense. Without this asymmetry within a generally balanced design, there is nothing interesting in architecture. Symmetry happens indirectly. The ending eventually responds to the beginning, but as a function of the totality of the work. We can call this a self-circling or self-canceling strategy. It achieves a symmetry at a higher level than the literal, but the literal level can be used as a guide to find the hidden symmetries at higher levels. The literal symmetry in Vertigo is the fact that one actress plays two parts. She splits herself up into two reverse images, and it takes the spin of the hero's undoing to connect them to conclude the film, a truly thaumatropic ending. The schema has been derived from the Cretan paradox's tessera function, its axiomatic unconscious. If we had time to develop a more Lacanian case for what is happening, we would try to show how the human unconscious in general is thaumatropic, how it allows for expansion, randomization, and yet recombines in a determinate order. For now, however, we can connect to the more familiar idea that Hitchcock had his own version of the Lacanian unconscious, the MacGuffin, which was some element of the plot that was completely gratuitous and even sometimes meaningless, but nonetheless justified the characters acting in the way they did. In language in general, there are things we can't explain, but nonetheless they let us glue together the things we want to say. This is not so much a throwaway element, a fiction we need to tell our limited truths. It is what makes for a larger truth by connecting our conscious limits to our unconscious lack of limits. In a Lacanian critique, it's necessary to continually connect with non-Lacanian examples that independently verify Lacan's sometimes seemingly idiosyncratic ideas. The late 19th century British author Lewis Carroll was not just the author of fantasies such as Through the Looking Glass and Alice in Wonderland. He was a logician who devised a pre- or non-Boolean system based on the kind of combinatorial cancellations we see Lacan devise for his model of the unconscious. Carroll devised puzzles that used logic divorced from the meaning content of statements and were based simply on their symmetries and inversions. You could say that these puzzles were self-intersecting in that all the parts are presented as separate but later they combine with themselves, and non-orienting, since every statement but two are split into halves and scattered around to combine with other halves. When they are found and rejoined, like the two halves of the tessera, the inverses are non-orientable, that is, one is upside down to the other. The point is not how to find these two orphaned elements that combine to make the answer to the puzzle, but how many crazy situations were created by separating the halves, which would then cancel out and preserve the idempotent value of the collection. This is a true palindromic structure, allowing for variety of an almost infinite kind while preserving a constant value, a return to the two elements that had been separated and concealed within the pile of nonsensical, or rather self-balancing details. Everything I've said to this point can be said outside the field of Lacanian psychoanalysis. The difference is that, inside the field, there is coherence and a way to explain each part in relation to human subjectivity. But the outside connections are critical. They demonstrate that Lacan's system is not tautological, not created out of self-fulfilling prophecies. Thus, we take something that inside psychoanalysis would be described in terms of the way time works in compulsive returns to traumatic points that cannot be described but only re-experienced. But for the moment, we can drop the Lacanian Freudian terminology, which would involve terms such as Nachträglichkeit and après-coup, special forms of circularity and repetition, and look at the independent evidence of mathematics. The palindrome itself has an internal numerical solidity. If you reverse sequences of numbers and subtract, reverse, then add, you will get some amazingly well-structured results. By this I mean that the sequence of 10s, 89s, 989s will prevail. This weird effect of numeric palindromes has captured the imagination of David Acheson, who wrote a book on the subject. But close to architecture is the book by the London-based architect-engineer Cecil Belmont, an homage to the number 9. This is not just a biography of this last number in the decimal system, but a study of how 9 seems to have come from outer space to join its more mundane cousins. In fact, if you subtract any palindromic sequence from itself, you will have a sigma of 9. A sigma is the sum of all of the numbers. So the sigma of 156 would be 12, or 1 plus 2, which is 3. The shape of the letter 9 tells you a lot, since it suggests a spiral version of infinity, a connection of the very small to the very large. It is, in fact, the perfect number to represent the thaumatrope, since it spins its opposite capabilities whenever it is involved in combinations, reversals, and multiplications of itself. Just as we can move away from Lacan's description of subjective systems to mathematics, it's possible and even necessary to connect to ethnography and linguistics. Although it's common in Chinese and even Chinese American culture to protect doorways with symbols that drive away evil, it's tempting to connect this porch railing with its approximation of the ideogram for luck and say that repeating it 3 times has some significance. Doubling the ideogram in Chinese means fluke, so could it be possible that a third instance would turn the fluke into the scam? Scotty thinks it's a fluke that the beautiful Madeline is standing at his door waiting for him to come back home. Afterwards, they team up and wander around together, as they put it. But the progression of luck to fluke to scam is actually a summary of the plot of Vertigo, and no one I know of has written about this. Certainly, each of the 3 parts of the story, the rooftop chase, Elster's proposition, and the remake of Judy are essential. Take one away, and you don't have a story as good as Vertigo. The same with the scam. It takes three elements. Without the shill, the con has no way to engage the mark. This is the same logic that Lacan describes using the famous Borromeo knot, where any two rings are joined only if there is one extra ring holding them together. Initially, they look like rings stacked on top of each other, but then we notice how each ring tucks under the next ring, creating an infinite loop. Lacan compared this knot geometry with the three domains of subjectivity, the real, imaginary, and symbolic, what he called the RSI system. The symbolic was the realm of language and other sign systems. The imaginary was our perception of what we call the sensorium, including things we can sense, even in an imaginary way. And the real was a traumatic remainder that resisted being symbolized in any way, and in the imaginary presented itself as impossible. The Borromeo knot was a means of getting away from seeing these domains as categories and more of a self-interactive system. But the knot was not just an analogy. Lacan wanted to show how knot theory continued to inform the system, how subjectivity had a purely mathematical, purely automated side, a kind of non-human element inside the human, operating at the most intimate level. So far, I'm the only person to use what's called Gauss coding to show how Lacan was on the right track, maybe even more than he knew. In short, Gauss coding shows that there is a second form of virtuality present, in addition to the virtuality we use in a Euclidean way to picture the rings in space. This is a virtuality of effectiveness, what holds the rings together. Gauss coding shows how, in the self-intersecting stack of three rings, there is a fourth ring, a virtual ring. On the intersection labeled 1, the blue ring goes over the red ring, so there is a minus for red and a plus for blue. The same notation is made for all of the 6 intersections, but there is a curious pattern of spaces left over, because only 2 rings are touching at a time, but they are held in place by the third ring, which offers the chance of a tuck that holds the knot together and makes every ring both a bottom and a top. The blank spaces are like a virtual power, a pattern that is the effectiveness of the knot, the axiom of how the knot is a knot. And, if anything, the knots are idempotent. They are tied to stay tied. They insulate themselves from the space around them, which is untied, and this insulation is virtual. The fourth ring, which is entirely invisible to the 3 rings of the Borromeo knot, works like a torus that allows a free expansion and contraction without ever entering into the void that lies in the middle. The shape has no edge, and imaginary travelers moving across its surface can travel in a circle and return to the spot they left. This property of self-intersection is not disorienting. Like moving around the earth, you arrive back in the same position that you started with. This means that you don't notice the void. You don't notice the bump created by the delta. The dreamer stays inside the dream, unaware of external disturbances. This is how idempotency works. I use a spindle torus to show that the 2 circuits overlap, and that this overlap is the place where the palindrome delta maintains the insulation required by the scam. In Vertigo, this is the way part 1 works. Scotty is in the dark and unaware of Judy's thaumatropic function. He has self-intersection, but without non-orientation. His circle continually intersects Madeline's because it is his duty as a detective to follow her motions. But he is unaware that Madeline is really the actress Judy. The double circuit involves a secret zone, a void. At this point, we have good reason to return to Lacan to settle an important point. Demand is something we make to another person or persons to get something we want. But this other is a construct we make ourselves, an image of a different human whose thoughts are unknown to us. We imagine that they want us to do something, so we respond to that desire rather than our own. It is a circular situation. We don't know what the other wants, so our demand is always lacking something. It has to repeat itself to feel out the other's real desire. The essence of demand is its repetition, its circular form, always concluding at a blank that sets in motion another cycle. The set of repetitions itself creates a circle as it tries to feel out the other's desire. These two voids are the reason that what someone says they want is never exactly what they mean they want, because their desire doesn't actually belong to them. They have constructed an entity called the other that is projected onto actual people they see as important, or generalized and collectivized in ideas of the other gender, the government, the church, or society. The intersecting circles of the spindle torus allow us to make a big connection that is not usually made by Lacanians, although it was inferred by Lacan when he talked about knots or the topologies of the Mobius band, the Klein bottle, or other projective surfaces. The fourth ring, which is entirely invisible to the three rings of the Borromeo knot, works like a torus that allows free expansion and contraction without ever encountering the void that lies in the middle. But this is not the void of the normal torus. This void is a trap that keeps Scotty dreaming until the scheme to use him as an ideal witness has completed its circuit. The imaginary traveler across the surface is not aware that its circuit is in any way odd. It is like traveling across the surface of the earth. You arrive back at the spot you left, facing in the same direction. This is the Euclidean fantasy. Scotty must not wake up from this fantasy, but the torus must conceal a void inside it, a void that paralyzes Scotty and turns him into a guided missile whose target is the witness chair at the suicide inquest. His trajectory must be perfect, so the world that revolves around him must not move out of alignment. He must not discover the void at its center. The delta function is an anamorphic operator to preserve this perfect trajectory by piling on pairs of elements that will perfectly cancel themselves out, thanks to Madeline's story of Carlotta. The revolving is revolutionary, literally, for the human subject, because it keeps things going without our conscious involvement or even awareness. It is a machine that runs in the background, silently, an automaton generating meaningfulness with or without meanings to support it. Instrumental cause has been vilified in architecture theory. It was taken from a religious context, something that brought about a transformation by means of an effective virtuality, insulating the transformation from any intentionality or accident. Architects assigned it to the evils of technology, concentrated by the Enlightenment and Industrial Revolution, the seeming reduction of human subjectivity to the will of machines and those who used machines to amass wealth and power. Technology did have this effect, very well described by Jacques Ellul and Lewis Mumford, but this is not instrumental cause. It is not even technique or technology. It is the persistent eclipse of the real and imaginary by the symbolic, the ego basis of a fantasy reality. And no better example can be given than that of Euclidean Perspectivalism, which architecture theorists proclaim as the basis of humanism. In the name of Euclid, they reject the very form geometry that preceded Euclid, but went under the name of the uncanny until it was formalized by a geometry by Pappus of Alexandria in 300 AD, and later by Girard Desargues and Blaise Pascal in the 17th century. Thus, architecture theory has been denied the powerful tool of projective geometry and the equally powerful concept of instrumental cause, without which dreams, the unconscious, and works of art cannot be understood, even minimally. These and the principle of idempotency that lies behind each of these components are what make the human subject a subject. They cannot be underestimated. Now we come to an interesting point that has not been widely recognized by Lacanians. It is a point that visual artists and architects might actually think of. In fact, the only reference I could find is Rosalind Krauss's essay on the anti-visual. In the palindrome that maintains a constant energy level by balancing each rise and fall, we might place figure on one side of the equation and ground on the other, indicating that anything we recognize as a figure is a figure because it subtracts something from what we call the ground. The two work in a palindromic zero-sum way. So if there is a reversal of figure and ground, the sum still has to be maintained, and this is key to the way that dreams function when the sleeper dreams he or she is moving, but is actually motionless. Figure-ground reversal is quite easy to repurpose, repackage, and export, as we see here in the game of blind man's bluff, or buff. This is how the basic of how a mark is disadvantaged in some way, here a blindfold, so that everyone knows the lay of the land except him. No matter where the blind man moves, reality is adjusted around him to avoid being tagged. The sighted observer sees where things are and how they are moving around. To level the playing field, the players around the blind man must be fixed to the ground and squirm around to avoid the blind man's touch. Here we are invited to look at something that represents the unrepresentable, the real of not being able to be looked at. So to get around that apparent contradiction, we are given the story of Medusa. Medusa was one of 3 sisters, so the story goes, who were used to protect boundaries, just as a skull and crossbones is used to warn us off from drinking a bottle of poison. Such images were called apotropes, meaning things that turn would-be trespassers back. Again, the thaumatropic function of turning reflected in the story of Medusa that she was originally so beautiful that no one could look at her without being frozen in place. This is appearance reaching over the median between the viewer and the viewed to strike at the viewer. We know that this actually happens in real life. It's called the Stindall Syndrome, where people have been known to collapse or even die when they are standing in front of a work of art. This has happened so often in front of Botticelli's painting of the birth of Venus that curators have discussed putting up warning signs. Just as Zephyr, the wind god, blows from beyond the painting space into the sea space in an act of divine incontinence to make the foam that becomes Venus, the painting itself blows or radiates outward from its space into the spectator's space, violating it in an act of aesthetic incontinence. The film The Great Beauty, which takes place in Rome, opens with the death of a Japanese tourist at the top of the Janiculum Hill. He has a heart attack as he is photographing the city below. The violation of the median boundary between the viewer and the viewed is what makes us aware of the boundary in the first place. Otherwise, we would pay no attention to it. Yet some people with schizophrenia believe that they can affect things by looking at them, a phenomenon called extramission. And, to some extent, Medusa is using extramission to disable anyone who would look in her direction. The secret of the connection between paralysis, looking, and boundaries is given away by the 1950s science fiction film The Day the Earth Stood Still. This metallic robot guards the spaceship that has landed on the mall in Washington, D.C. Beams from his slit eye melts weapons. Its energy comes from the simple fact of figure ground reversal. The space visitors represent the confederation of all galaxies in space, and when the spaceship lands, it condenses the collective brightness of the galaxies, just as the ship has condensed the message of the confederation to Earthlings. The Insight Out has placed the ship that was at the marginal ring between Earth and outer space at the Earth's geopolitical center. So the power of the ring is transformed into a beam that radiates from the center at the same energy level. The figure ground reversal effect of the Stindall Syndrome can be diversified by holding in position someone who is blind to what is really going on around him. In the dream, the necessary paralysis of the sleeper is maintained by reversing the figure ground relation, so that the dream moves across the immobile dreamer, but the dreamer experiences moving across the fixed field of the dream. This reversal of the figure ground is prone to bugs and glitches, where the moving frame cannot cover some unforeseen circumstance. Like the Truman Show, where a single naive character, Truman, was surrounded by actors and sets controlled by an all-powerful director hidden in a fake moon. Occasionally, a piece of equipment would short out or fall from the fake sky. Like the so-called computer bug, this could come from the outside or be an internal programming error. The difference doesn't matter, because the difference between inside and outside is itself neutralized by the moving field and fixed viewer arrangement. Self-intersection and non-orientation, which would be a scandal in the Euclidean waking world, here are parts of the Phantasmagoria. In the Truman Show scam, we look closely at the rough edges of the scam, the point where the scam starts to show through into Truman's conception of his life as an autonomous being. A radio malfunctions in ways that Truman can't attribute to reality. A theatrical light falls from what looks to him to be a normal sky. The con artist, Christoph, is like a malfunctioning, not totally omnipotent God who must keep his production team under tight control. Because we realize the scam, looking at how it might at any minute fall apart becomes a source of drama and suspense. Truman discovers the real as a void through which he is finally able to escape from the Truman Show's setup, the con that has held him idempotent for his whole life by automating a ground that moves around his trapped figure. This works like a hole in space itself, since the space Truman imagined lacked a dimension, the dimension of control the director used to keep him in place. When Truman sails his boat to the edge of the set, the painted sky, he activates a trope that has been around for quite a while, although only a few art historians have acknowledged it. This is the idea that our Euclidean space stops at a point it labels as infinity, but infinity is not the actual terminus of all space. It is a portal, and what lies beyond this portal is called projective geometry. When Picasso does the same thing with the torn curtain that is really the sky in his revolutionary painting, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, he adds some useful information. The figure of melancholy comes from Dürer and other sources in the emblem tradition. They all note that melancholics contemplate suicide as a form of release into another world, what Dürer called a limen caelo, or gate of heaven, guarded by imponderable mysteries, such as the anagram of the numerical square, the geometrical solid that is an immersion of a cube into another dimensional sphere, the hourglass as emblematic of time's reversibility, and other objects directly depicted or subliminally concealed. An idempotency analysis of Dürer's Melancholia I would look to the way reversibility and alternative positioning are stylized, the numbers revealing hidden dates and codes, the title shifting into the gate of heaven, positioned at the moon in the sky beyond the seascape, and finally melancholy herself, misspelled on purpose to connect to the idea of escape from her own version of Sea Haven, Florida. We are even shown the point where the melancholy Truman would sail his boat and find his stairway, and Dürer gives us a ladder to guide the way, a glide path of idempotency automating the melancholic hero to the end of the scam, although end here means escape from. We know where Truman would be headed in this image, but also why melancholy is depressed. She is sandwiched between signifiers. She has not yet been able to reorder the pile of objects in her puzzle and to find that Amos Judd loves cold mutton. But what is key here is the expandability of things that are split in half and scattered in order to join other objects half to half. Lacanian psychoanalysis is not simply a clinical therapy for patients who suffer from neurosis. Lacan drew from art, religion, culture, and history to show how psychoanalysis appeared in the pages of history as well as popular culture, not just because subjects of all ages and cultures suffer in the same ways from their subjectivity, but because all humans use speech in the process of ordering society and their places as individuals within it. From the start, Lacan focused on the role of metaphor and metonymy in perception and mental constructs, developing a general theory of the signifier. In the 1960s, he devised a comprehensive theory of discourse that was similar in some ways to Shannon and Weaver's by then famous diagram of communications, but differed from it by showing how the same elements could take on a myriad of configurations. These were grouped around four main figures. Two of them, the discourse of the master and the discourse of the university, were the most historic. The other two, the hysteric and analysis, focused on the inner life of the subject. Lacan, like many French intellectuals living in Paris in the 50s, attended the lectures on Hegel's phenomenology given by Alexander Kojève, who presented a particularly vivid account of Hegel's parable of the master and slave. The master wants mastery over all the other masters, and he's willing to fight to the death to achieve this. The irony, of course, is that if he succeeds, there will be no other masters left to recognize and admire him, only the servants who opted out of this stupid competition, the ones who realized that they could make a buck or two out of the master's idiotic struggle. Lacan abbreviated Hegel's parable in schematic terms that can be interpreted in several ways. Due to the simple fact that you don't ever have just one signifier, but a system of signifiers, a whole dictionary of them, in fact, Lacan asks how discourses take form to create different kinds of relationships, different systems within systems. Curiously, Lacan makes a topological comparison. He takes the simplest form of a knot, a self-intersecting figure called the interior eight. This is different from saying that any signifier is what it is because it relates to other signifiers. It is saying that the reciprocities joining signifiers into discourses constitute circuits that are able to neutralize the inside-outside relationship. From the inside, the discourse can be alienating for those who use it, and the discourse can incorporate things from the outside, an externality that is intimate. This is really significant. Topology shows the different forms that discourse takes are also about different ways of incorporating things external to them, things in what we often call the real world. The subject is, as Freud puts it, never master in its own house. The irony of the master's discourse is that the master limits him or herself, then kicks him or herself out of his or her own house. But the out was already in, so the result is a kind of adventure in Oz, a kind of death dream. There is a lot of drama in Lacan's theory of the four discourses. Each tells its own tale. Each involves particular kinds of drama, different endings, different expectations, and suspense. Basically, the master-slave as discourse is about the claims or holds one person has on another. Initially, this begins as a claim of mastery. Someone has power and demands recognition. But the other is a subject just as much as the one who is demanding mastery, and this subject also demands recognition. The two subjects must fight it out to the end of the process, where all competition has been met and dispatched. But now there is no one to give what was desired in the first place, recognition. There is only the slave, the servant, the helper, whose status as a non-combatant disqualifies him or her as a potential master able to recognize the other master's success. This is the irony of the master-slave paradox. Would-be masters set up a system that will annihilate them. The only ones who survive are the slaves or servants who have given over their will to the masters. The product of all this is what the slaves have produced, which is nothing to be sniffed at. Goods, services, shelters, security, but also the knowledge required to put these things together. The product was a byproduct, while the main object was self-destroyed by its own design. The subject, therefore, is barred or bound. This is the truth of the situation, that the flip of the byproducts of the project aiming to secure recognition and dominance, has the masters being mastered by the slaves, or at least their products, or the envy the masters have for the slaves' enjoyment, which seem to them to be more direct, more enjoyable. The masters are in the position that they do not enjoy the things enjoy them. Without Lacan's matheme, as difficult as it seems to be at first glance, we would not have noticed this aspect of the shill, who shilly-shallies from one face to another. Hitchcock seems to have read his Lacan, because he constructs Judy, the actress, and the wife Madeline in just such a way that shows how the product, the little a, is simultaneously a love and a lack, and ultimately a loss that is essential to the story. Possibly, we would not have noticed the structure of the scam without our Lacanian matheme. Certainly, we would have not been able to connect the anamorphosis we see on the screen with the way the hero of the film, the detective Scotty Ferguson, is the perfect mark because his vertigo dizziness connects directly to the spinning function of the shill Judy. Is the scam structure the unconscious of Vertigo? It's tempting to say this, because it seems to keep the action and characters in line. But this tempts us to confuse the unconscious as a kind of template. Lacan would want to say that there is a discourse of the master at work in Vertigo, without ruling out the fact that other discourses are also present. Judy pretends to be the hysterical Madeline. This attracts Scotty, who then pretends to be an analyst. This makes room for university discourse, the fourth form, in the way that what is evident to the film's audience is the same thing that is seen by the point of view character Scotty, who plays the S2 as a spy or detective constructing knowledge about what's happening to Madeline. Behind him, lurking in the shadows, is S1, the master behind the scenes, pulling all the strings. And to the right is the function the master has used to draw Scotty in, the left-handed attractiveness of Judy that serves as a lure to the detective who has a life history of romantic failure. Scotty is actually the product of this university setup. He's a barred subject who is held in place within the scheme until he is called to sit as a witness at the inquest, where his testimony will be the jewel in the crown of the scam. Who could possibly be a more credible witness than a retired police detective who has failed to complete his assignment? Only Elster could have worked out this brilliant plan, which is evident in the structure of university discourse. Not only does the whole matheme become a thaumatrope, rotating from the configuration of the master to that of the university, but the fraction or ratio expressions on the left and right flip. S2 was on the bottom. Now it's on the top. The little a, 2. But even internally, we saw that the a, which Lacan called the object cause of desire, because it was only a cause and nothing solid, was also the function of flipping. Scotty, in the position of being a product, puts the flip in the form of the evidence he gives, which he thinks is truthful, but of course it supports Elster's switch of Madeline for Judy. Everything in the scam converts the true into the false and vice versa. When we say that human language automatically engages a paradox, thanks to the fact that it is both a communication of content as well as the act that has its own implications in cultural functions, we find in something as silly as the paradox of the Cretan liar a forced choice condition that is more than just saying if you're true, you're false, and if you're false, you're true. There is a circulation between these positions that maps this impossible space onto the torus. Even if we don't specify a spindle torus to get the same Vesica Pisces shape we identify here as the delta, the fact is that there are two interconnected voids, thanks to the fact that we use signifiers to represent our experience in the world. And thanks to the fact that this void of language relates to the voids created and sustained by our architectural experience, we can make further use of the topology of surfaces that are non-orientable and self-intersecting. Because this delta space is also the key to the scam in Vertigo, we can also consider how it is the shape of the void in architecture. An architectural void is not simply an empty space. It is a space where we experience as a void, as an impossible passage, a liminal or marginal condition where our identity or even our existence comes into question. Hitchcock does this with the towers he uses in Vertigo as geodesic monuments. The Coit Tower on Telegraph Hill in San Francisco seems too directly to reference Scotty's sexual relation with Madeline, and the tower at the Mission San Juan Bautista outside of town is the negative counterpart, an end to his sexual relationship, but also an emasculation of his reputation as a detective and dependability as a protector. The towers precisely mark not only the presets of this scam, but the points where Hitchcock has used them to mark the key transition points of his story. It's exciting to see how this language-based marker can be returned to the one example of architecture that, in the Bible, is the first example of a major architectural project, the Tower of Babel, where God becomes anxious that humans, who are all speaking one language, have an indexical power over nature and will be able to assault the space of heaven. He puts an end to this by confusing their tongues, so to speak. No one will be able to understand each other. Therefore, architecture will lose access to the void of heaven and only be able to circle around it and treat it in negative ways. But this does not mean that the void will not be useful in the architectural and poetic imagination. It will mark the point of liminal transgression, places that people go where they are not allowed to go. We can imagine and even construct these spaces. We can tell stories about them. We can have actors give their closing speeches in them, as Scotty does in Vertigo. The void is a place where two kinds of space fold over onto each other, as when in Vertigo, the space of the scam folds over the space of Scotty's discovery. The symmetry of this lambda origami allows the pile of signifiers we have described as sorites to condense and form new meanings to emerge. But even more important, we have been given a form by which architecture, theology, topology, and ethnography have a common meeting place, something that functions the same for all of the human machines made to use it. This itself is like the towers that create an axis to gauge movement and change. As the story of Vertigo begins to unfold, we first see a circle of concerns that seem to use Coit Tower as their pivot point. The circle is a circuit, a means of conserving and circulating energy, accumulating it so that it will be able to apply itself at some critical point. This point is, of course, the weird behavior of Madeline, who seems to be drawn to suicide. And when she jumps into the waters beneath San Francisco Bay Bridge, Scotty has to break his cover and rescue her. It is unavoidable at this point that this explosion of energy be redirected to falling in love. with Coit Tower providing what we think is the center of this new project, where the couple wander about together but always return to town. But Madeline is a human thaumatrope, an alternator who converts direct current to alternating current. If I can continue the energy analogy, this conversion also converts the polarity of the circuit that binds Scotty to her, and a new circuit is set up with a new polarity now based on Madeline's death drive. With two towers, two circuits, and two circulations of energy around alternative regulating centers, Vertigo itself becomes a thaumatrope. The holes in the ancient thaumatropes become the corresponding towers that match up on the axis of death and life. It is always tempting to associate towers with sexual symbolism, and even more tempting when the tower in town is named Coit, and its obverse tower belongs to a convent. It's as if Scotty is encouraged to be a sexual being, then punished for going along. Even the red light, green light associations seem to signal denial, then permission, traffic signals to direct the flow of the story's energy and Scotty's libido.